Hello and welcome to Collective Worship. Welcome if you're watching in school and welcome if you're watching at home, and welcome to any mums and dads, grandparents, brothers, sisters, cats, dogs or whoever else is watching this too. This week I've been asked to talk to you about doing the right thing. So I'm going to tell you a story about a person who lived a very long time ago who made some really good choices even when she was in a scary situation. Her name was Esther. I wonder if any of you are called Esther. Some of you probably know people called Esther because it's a name we still use today. Today I want you to help me by joining in with the story. Esther is the heroine, so whenever I say her name, I want you to shout hooray, and I'll put a sign up on the screen like this. The baddie is a man called Haman, so whenever you hear his name, I want you to boo. The other two main characters are the king, and when I say king, I want you to make a crown sign on your head like this, and a man named Mordecai. Mordecai was a wise older relative of Esther, so when I say his name, we're going to stroke our pretend beards like this. At various times in the story, I'm going to put up a big question mark on the screen like this. When you see that, that's when someone has to decide what to do. So we're going to stop and think what we might do. Esther was Jewish, one of the people of Israel, descended from Abraham. But her family had been taken away from the land of Israel to live in the land of a powerful king. Esther's father and mother had died, and she was living with her cousin Mordecai, who was a good and wise man. Now the king had got cross with his queen and sent her away, and he wanted to find a new queen. So he told some of his servants to find beautiful young women and to bring them into his palace so that he could choose a new queen. Esther was one of the young women that was brought into the palace. The servants who looked after the women all liked Esther because she was good and kind and beautiful. Not everyone in that city liked the Jews, so Mordecai advised her not to tell anyone she was Jewish. But every day Mordecai walked to and fro near the gate of the palace, near where the women lived, so that he could talk to the servants and find out how Esther was and what was happening to her. Meanwhile, Esther, along with the other women, was given beauty treatments and lovely clothes to wear to make her ready to be presented to the king. And here's a picture someone painted about 150 years ago of what she might have looked like. I think she looks rather worried in this picture. Perhaps she had already realised that the king was a scary person and was afraid of what lay ahead. After a whole year of being made ready, the time came for Esther to be presented to the king. And out of all the young women, the king liked Esther the most and chose her to be his queen. Now one day, two of the king's officers became angry with the king and planned to attack and kill him. But Mordecai heard about the plot as he walked backwards and forwards outside the palace, and he told Esther, and Esther told the king. The officers were put in prison, and the king was safe. The king had a big book in which all the important things that happened were recorded, and what Mordecai had done was written down in the book. Now the king had a friend called Haman. The king liked Haman and commanded that everyone should kneel down when he came past as a sign of respect. Now Mordecai knew that Jews were not supposed to kneel and worship anyone except God. What should he do when Haman came past? Mordecai decided that it was more important to obey God than the commands of the king. So when Haman came past, he stayed standing up. Haman was very angry, and when he found out that Mordecai was a Jew, he wanted to have all the Jews killed. He went to the king and asked him to make a law that all the Jews should be killed, and promised that he would pay 10,000 pieces of silver to the king if he made the law. What do you think the king should do? Sadly, the king didn't really care very much about the Jews. He wasn't sure he knew any of them particularly well, and he quite fancied the 10,000 pieces of silver, so he made the law that Haman wanted. When Mordecai heard this, he was very unhappy, and he went and stood outside the palace so that he could send a message in to Esther to tell her what had happened. He asked Esther to go and ask the king to save her people. But Esther was scared. Even the queen wasn't allowed to just walk in and see the king. She was supposed to wait till he summoned her, and he hadn't done that for over 30 days. If she just walked in, the king could have her killed. So she sent a message to Mordecai to explain all this. Mordecai sent a message back to her. Do not think that because you are in the king's house, you alone of all the Jews will escape. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place, but you and your father's family will perish. And who knows but that you have come to royal position for such a time as this? Whatever should Esther do? Esther decided to do a very brave thing. But first of all, she sent a message back to Mordecai asking him to get all the Jews to pray for her for 3 days. On the 3rd day, Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner court of the palace in front of the king's hall. And here's another picture of Esther, showing her standing outside the king's doorway. In her hand, she's holding her crown, ready to put it on her head to stand before the king. And the king looked up and saw Esther. And when he saw her, he was pleased to see her. And he said, "What is it, Queen Esther? What is your request? I will give you whatever you want, even up to half my kingdom." Esther said, "If it pleases the king, let the king, together with Haman, come today to a banquet I have prepared." So that evening, Haman and the king sat down to a wonderful banquet with Esther. When they had finished, the king asked her again, "What is your request?" Esther replied, "If the king regards me with favour, let the king and Haman come tomorrow to the banquet I will prepare, and then I will answer the king's question." That night, the king could not sleep. Maybe he'd eaten too much dinner. So he ordered one of his servants to bring in his big book and read to him some of the important things that had happened in his reign. And the man just happened to read the part about Mordecai saving the king's life. "What reward has been given to Mordecai?" asked the king. "Nothing," he was told. So he asked Haman, "What should be done for the man the king delights to honour?" And Haman thought the king must want to reward him and said, "Let them bring a royal robe the king has worn, and a horse the king has ridden, and let them robe the man and lead him on the horse through the city, proclaiming, 'This is what is done for the man the king delights to honour.'" "Go at once," the king commanded Haman, "and do for Mordecai as you have suggested." And Haman had no choice. He had to do as the king commanded, and he was furious. That evening, the king and Haman went to Esther's second banquet, and the king asked Esther, "What is your request?" And Esther answered, "If I have found favour with you, O king, and if it pleases your majesty, grant me my life. That is my request, and spare my people, for we have been sold to be killed." The king asked Esther, "Who is he? Who is this man that wants to do this vile thing?" And Esther pointed at Haman and said, "My enemy is Haman." The king got up in a rage and didn't even finish his dinner. And Haman was taken away by the soldiers, and Esther and all the other Jews were saved because of Esther's bravery in going to talk to the king. As ever, I'm going to finish with a prayer. Listen carefully, and if you agree with it, join in with an Amen at the end. Dear God, help us to make good choices and to stand up for what we know is right, even when it's hard. Amen. Thank you for listening and for joining in. See you next time.